Welcome, everybody, to Indivisible TX Lege Live. We're excited to be with you this Sunday evening. We are continuing our series called The Reader Corner that we have been doing throughout this year. Took a little bit of a break during the summer. We had a couple of nasty special sessions and as well as other things happening throughout the state of Texas. Derailed our reading a little bit, but we're excited to get back on track with all of you and to share with you the amazing readings that we've been doing and that we plan to do. For this particular month, we actually read the book Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds by Adrienne Maree Brown. So this is the book we're going to talk about today. If you have not heard of this book, we're excited that you're with us because we want you to definitely read this book. This was amazing for us to read, and we're excited to jump into this conversation. Before we go around the table around this, I just want to share a little description when we use the term emergent strategy, what we're talking about. And there's a couple of different ways that the author describes this and defines this. But one easy way for us to know about it is emergent strategy is how we intentionally change in ways that grow our capacity to embody the just and liberated worlds we long for. So this is at the heart of the work that we're trying to do here at Indivisible TX Lege. So with me, I want to introduce our table of readers. We have Kirk Pate with us today. Kirk, great to see you. We have Lauren Ortel. We have Sharon Kramer and Jasmine Tolhurst. How are all y'all doing today?
Very well, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Discussion.
Let's jump into this conversation. I think we're all eager for it. So let's go around the table and just talk about our first impressions of what we felt reading this book. What you thought about the author's perspective. There's a couple of key areas we're going to jump into after that, but just general, just kind of perspectives on reading this book. Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to. My first impression was, ooh, this is an organizer. She gets me, she gets us, and I am excited to learn from her. And it just, the whole way through was just lots of yes, yes, and thank you for that. And I haven't thought of it in that way. That is so helpful. So yeah, I can just tell this isn't someone, in an ivory tower, an academic perspective of someone who researches this work. This is someone in the work, like we are. So I loved it.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren.
I will second that. And I think that she asked a lot of hard questions, a lot of thought-provoking questions. It was a very challenging book in that her thinking really challenges the status quo and the way that society brings us up in a competitive lack mindset rather than creating the future that we want to see.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jasmine.
I found it, well, I initially read it about 6 weeks ago. And because of the delay that Alex mentioned, I had to pick it back up and kind of do a refresher on it. But the book sort of had my head spinning because there's so many dimensions to it, so many dimensions, thought dimensions, action dimensions. And it's a book to be studied. I'm hearing from people among us that much of it sort of instantly resonated. A lot of it didn't instantly resonate with me. But what I did find was so many truisms in the book, on a page here and a page there. And so that's the way I began to really connect with it, is to focus on the truisms that really related to me. But I'm hearing some of the others say that it more broadly resonated with them, which I think is great. I'm going to have to work at it some more.
Thanks, Kirk.
Kirk is right. It is a rich book. And Jasmine is right also. There is much there. There are places where I stumble. There are places that are a paradox. And I also loved what Lauren said about it is written by someone who is in the work and doing the work, not just directing others. I appreciated both the voice and her blending future looking and past experiences that she's had. I will read it again.
Yeah, I agree with everything everyone has said here. This was really a great book, hearing from the perspective of someone who's been wrestling with this work, who has been trying to. I like to use the term in our organizing, and when I work and collaborate with folks, we're all trying to mold a clay, and we're all doing it together. And it really feel like through this book, she's sharing that experience and that perspective of how she's navigated and molded all of these experiences and everything, right? And so for me, I was locked in right from the beginning. She was speaking my language. She was talking directly to me. I felt a lot of the thoughts that I've been struggling with and some of the frustrations I've had, not only within our organizing space in terms of how we, have progress and how we have change in the things we're working on, but just in life in general and how life is in today's world. And so it was such a great selection, and highly encourage anybody who's wanting to read how we can change the way we're doing things, especially within now the 21st century. This is a great book to pick up. And so really, really appreciate the author's perspective and her use of literature and film. There's a couple of authors now that we've read and I've started to read over the last couple of years that now that I've gotten older, I'm 39 now, and I think I've referenced this in another reader corner, they're using my, my experience as reference points and things like that. And that's so powerful to read. Now that I'm getting older, to see that people's lived experiences are very similar to mine in different ways. And, and even though they've had different experiences, there's those similarities. And so I get a big fan. So I had to listen to the Matrix soundtrack when she brought up the Matrix, so that when I started reading, I was hearing the score. So things like that were very, very great. So we're going to jump into a couple of topics that we kind of have planned. By no means are we going to be able to cover everything in this book, because there is so much. And Sharon, Kurt, to your point, reading this a little bit more, I think is something that I'm going to look forward to doing. And there's some of those key books where you revisit and read and digest and continue to chew on. And this is definitely one of those. Lauren, I want to hand this off to you because you had something about critical connections.
I did. Something in here got me especially excited when I thought about Indivisible TX Lege, and something that y'all do that I would love to see all other groups, all other organizations focus on, especially as we are in the place where we are in Texas right now, and we have so much to do, but also a lot of opportunity. And it's this idea. And so if you have a copy of the book, on page 28, she talks about the idea that critical connections are more important in a long-term transformation process than critical mass. Relationships are everything. And then even before that, she talks about instead of going a mile wide and an inch deep, going an inch wide and a mile deep. So I just love that idea of how do we really treat every person who engages with us, who decides to volunteer with us as the precious opportunity that they are, and just to bring them into the work and to welcome them. And the TX Lege group has a wonderful process for that. And I would love for Sharon to talk a little bit about this, but essentially, Sharon is a part of the onboarding and welcoming committee. And I think it's just an excellent way to make sure that once someone is, kind of puts their toe in and says, maybe I'll check y'all out, maybe I'll try something. If they get that warm welcome and they have someone that can talk about what the group and organization are about, what we've been doing, what we're working on, what's ahead, and also talking about or listening to them and where their skills and interests and energies are, then making that connection of knowing where to plug them in. I just think it's brilliant, and I would love to see so much more of that. Sharon, can you talk a little bit about what you do with onboarding and welcoming new volunteers?
Yeah, it was a good process, and it worked in a variety of situations. So initially, our folks interested in us click on a link on our website, the Join Us, and there is a Google form. They complete that, and it bounces straight to me. And I look over them every morning at morning coffee and think, look at all these folks I get to meet. It was always on Zoom. Don't think I've been able to do any in person so far. And we would meet in groups. And I think this was helpful because people could get a sense of others that were there. And having a cohort creates those critical. I shy away from the word critical, but I realize why she uses it. But they do need to be significant relationships. I know that's what keeps me going. And we would go through an onboarding. I would show them pictures and PowerPoints. We'd stop to talk and chat. We never got to do my favorite thing, which is to take apart a poem, but it wasn't, I couldn't find one that would have worked, or Alex knows I certainly would have done that. But I love meeting people. And I've worked in other kinds of organizations. Schools are highly structured. That's a vast experience that I have. Indivisible TX Lege is a different kind of structure. And I always made sure to emphasize our grassroots nature and our very shoulder to shoulder, which makes it a kind of a flat organization. It is awkward sometimes, and sometimes it feels clunky, but meeting people and helping them get situated always inspired me, always. It was a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been an incredible contribution to the work, so thank you. Did anyone else have any thoughts on these critical connections, relationships?
Well, I think the way Lauren and Sharon put it is that the process of onboarding involves a lot of assessment about the potential quality of the connection that the individual can make, not just to the organization, but to other individuals. And so it's not, so that onboarding is not a matter of how many numbers I can get, how many people. It very much has to do with the individual and the potential of that individual in connecting in a role in the organization and with other individuals. So it's not a mass onboarding process. That's not the objective. It's the quality of the individual and the connections that ultimately matter and will affect retention, let's say, and what someone gets out of the participation in the organization. So it has a huge relevance to the matter of onboarding and focusing on the individual and relationships.
Yeah, she talks about the depth of relationships between individuals in a system determines the strength of the system. Over and over again, she relates, our society and our relationships to the way nature is connected and the way nature thrives and succeeds based on its relationships and structure with one another. And I just love that. As you said, like the depth of connection with people, because each person has the capacity to create to be a leader, to take charge, and to move forward with their passions. Each of us has a passion for something, and we don't all have to be creating the same thing to be creating together.
Love that. Love that. Yeah, I think the critical connections piece is so important when we're looking at really wanting to move forward and change the way we are organizing and how we're affecting change. And this whole book is around these ideas to improve how we're doing that. And this critical connections is something that we're seeing a lot. We hear the term relational organizing a lot when it comes to get out the vote, in terms of how people respond to vote for somebody or to actually participate in voting as a piece of that. And I think for us in organizing, what's been exciting, and we're going to touch on this a little bit later down the road, is just that process of how we got there and where we're trying to get with onboarding. And so we didn't start off with the current process we have right now, but we learned to implement this process. And so I think the next level for us is to continue as people get onboarded in this way and can understand this kind of dynamic within our organization, that as new people are onboarded, all the organizers who are currently in there have this desire for critical connections. And it's when we collectively have this desire for these critical connections with the people we're working with, then it does help all of us become stronger in our work, because you do feel connected. And it's really about extending the family and bringing people on board, whether we're all working on the same thing or not. We have that connection with each other. And so really, really great topic in the book.
To tag on to what Alex also said, the thing about the quality of the connections has to do with arriving at a vision. And connections can help arrive at a vision that everyone can hold on to and provide and that gives them direction. And so, sort of the inverse of this is the lack of those critical connections are going to make the mission murky, the vision murky. But the quality of the connections has a lot to do with how widely held the common vision is. And so there's multiple dimensions just to the business of connections.
Yeah, I think the key with that vision is it doesn't have to be super specific, that people are just latching onto a thing to do, but it's around us trying to have progress, trying to do certain things and cultivating that energy. And then Jasmine, to your point, what you shared, then people get to really figure out how they want to have a part within that work. And so a lot of exciting things. Go ahead, Jasmine.
I highlighted all over this book. I just want to let you know. She says, it's a way for humans to practice being in right relationship to our home and each other, to practice complexity and grow a compelling future together through relatively simple interactions. Maybe, if I'm honest, it's a philosophy for how to be in harmony and love in and with the world. And so I love how simple she makes it, and yet how complex and big and difficult it can be. It's not easy, but it can be simple.
Love it. Well, I think a part of that she talks about is really our next topic, Sharon, that you're going to kind of help us lean into. And this really has to talk about the tone of this book that she really had, and then the perspective she brought. So I'm going to hand this off to you.
I was struck that this is a woman with a keen, sharp mind and with lots of strong experiences, but she is not harsh. She is welcoming and she is insistent, and it is a particularly female voice with a strong ethos for community. I love books that sort of cross genres, and I've always thought that we learn the most when we mix genres, when we blend, for example, academic disciplines, not to go too far that direction, but she finds truth in fiction and she finds great truth in poetry, which means she understands the value of spirit. And that is what art feeds and where art finds its source. So I was fascinated to be on this journey in her book when she talks about all the many things she's done, what a life she's lived, how many experiences she's had. For example, not many women or men are doulas, and a doula is the ultimate example of a nurturer, supporting not just the person and a baby, but supporting the community. So I was captivated by the richness and depth in the book. I loved that she kept referencing so many different writers and poets.
Absolutely.
That kind of strikes true with me also, Sharon. I in my mind, I sort of think of it because she had so many diverse experiences. It's the eclecticism that provides inspiration. She is really an eclectic person, and she brings to bear these multiple dimensions into focus about developing community and so on, and how that development of that community sense of community can be a driving force in trying to achieve even say organizational objectives, I think.
Checking in. Any other thoughts people want to chime in on this tone of the book and just her experiences and everything?
I guess I also connected to, like Sharon, I also enjoy poetry and literature and how that kind of connects to everything. And so, yeah, throughout this book, she talks about the way that, interestingly, so science fiction is kind of, a part of coming up with what could the future be. And so often with organizing, we're stuck in each daily crisis, especially in Texas, like, what are we up against today? Oh, and now we're up against this. When, it's really helpful to kind of know what our end goals are, what are our big dreams of how things could look much different than they are now. So I just like how that's incorporated. And yeah, like with you bringing this up, Sharon, just the fact that she has connections in so many different parts of life and activities helps. And I think that's another part of why, there's so much strength and so much gained every time we bring another person and their experiences into the work with us, as they bring more than just, their volunteer time, because they're going to have a different perspective and experiences that can help us get to what those dreams could be.
Absolutely. That makes me think of the fact, like recognizing that we all have blind spots. And so the more people that I have around me with their perspective, they can point out areas in my thinking or my perspective that are flawed, or some piece of it that I'm not seeing. There's such value in community. There was like a spiritual overtone of kind of like the flow of the universe and nature and the way it just all works together, and just the interconnection of it all. And I love the thing that came to mind when Sharon was talking about her being a doula is, so she was talking about how she is a facilitator, that she is always a facilitator, that's what she does. And I thought of how being a doula is like the ultimate facilitator in creating, like co-creating life, bringing life into the world. Like, that's so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in our work, what we look at is, what we hope for is that the role of government is trying to accomplish this, right? All of this experience that she's had in these perspectives and trying to serve the people she serves in her work is a lot of the ideals we have for government. That government is hearing from all of us and understanding what is needed to be able to serve the community at large, and trying to do this very, very tough task. And it is very, very tough, especially when you have, you know, almost 30 million people in a state the size of Texas. And why we do our work, I think a big part of, for me, and what I see our org and a lot of our partners is we're trying to get government to understand, we're trying to get leaders, elected officials, to actually represent leadership that is wanting to do this. Because our current elected officials in Texas want to have a very narrow perspective of what society should be, of what government should be, of what people's lives should be. And this is really causing a huge conflict for a lot of folks in a lot of different ways. And so the failure of what we see in Texas elected officials, is really why we are all collectively responding in this way, because we envision a government that should be responsive to the people, and should be able to take in. And you can look at the process with the state legislature around public comments. You know, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Will they accommodate people to give public comments who can't get to Austin because of a pandemic? Not really, or not at all. Not that the pandemic needs to do that. Our state is so big that having another mechanism would be great for people to participate. But even when they do, we have marathon hearings where, you know, our organizers, a lot of other organizers, a lot of Texans, volunteers, what have you, will spend multiple hours, tens of hours, sometimes more than 24 hours, waiting to have their voice heard. And that just shows you the way that our legislature and our government is really approaching people's voice right now is simply to try to get it rushed through, try to get it over with as quickly as possible, because they already have their perspective. They already have their view that they want to push down on everyone versus hearing from the people and responding in that way.
And not only in Austin, but even at the local offices, there's not listening going on.
Right.
Not enough, not nearly enough.
So that takes us to our next section, Jasmine, with interdependence and decentralization. Help us hop into this topic.
You know, in Texas, you saying that, man, I can drive 8 hours and still be in Texas. So to get to Austin to testify, it's you know, it's crazy, and the way it's set up is really ineffective, to say the least, right? You know, interdependence is based around mutual reliance and shared leadership and like a vision. And like you said, Alex, their vision is super narrow. Texas is a very diverse state. Having such a narrow vision, it doesn't serve all Texans. There's no way that it could. And we should have the freedom to live our lives in the way that suits us. You know, we've had a lot of discussions around the freedom to do what we want to do during this pandemic, you know, and it's like, well, we're allowed to do what we're allowed to do as long as the mostly Republican leadership in Texas allows it. And that's just that it's not for the people or by the people whatsoever. You know, she talks about the competition in nature and how nothing is wasted. Like there is nothing wasted, even in, you know, a volcanic explosion, all of the ash goes to like fertilize the ground to create new life, right? But humans are unique because we compete when it isn't necessary, that we could reason our way to more sustainable processes but we use our intelligence to outsmart one another, that we compete for fun or for ego. Interdependence is when we can truly lean on others and they can lean on us. Like that requires trust. And we have to decentralize our ideas of solutions, of where decisions and solutions happen. I think in Texas, just in our society in general, when we look at one leader and we expect the one leader to have all of the answers and know all of the things that are going to solve our community's problems, that's unrealistic. And so we compete over resources, and we have what we have today. It's so divided, it's so ineffective. And I love the conversation around like not having to compete. So Indivisible TX Lege has a coalition space where we are actually working with multiple other organizers, so that we can collaborate, so that we can share in the work. Because like you said, our state is huge. There is enough work to go around, and wherever you're passionate, come change whatever section of your community or section of Texas that you want to change, because like we support that.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
All right, checking in to see if anyone wants to jump in.
So I will always take any opportunity I can to talk about individualism and how problematic it is and how it really relates to everything we're up against. So in the very beginning on page 8, she says, we have lived through a good half century of individualistic linear organizing led by charismatic individuals or budget building institutions, which intends to reform or revolutionize society, but falls back into modeling the oppressive tendencies against which we claim to be pushing. Some of those tendencies are seeking to assert one right way or one right strategy. Many align with the capitalistic belief that constant growth and critical mass is the only way to create change, even if they don't use that language. So I always come back to this about how we've been taught in this country that you work hard and you take care of yourself, maybe also plus your immediate family, and forget about everybody else. And that's the way it goes. And you just do what you're told and don't ask questions. And that's how we got here, right? And so I love that you brought this up, Jasmine, and just thinking about, why are we competing? Why is this all about like, oh, we have to focus on just ourselves? And that means that it's either us or them, right? It's always like there's a limited pie, and really we can just make the pie bigger. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, and I think that notion of competition, which is deeply ingrained in our economic system, is an impediment to seeking and developing the kind of community that she talks about, where where competition, when you don't need to compete, should be, jettisoned. But it, Jasmine's comments and yours too, Lauren, also point out how ingrained the competitive notion is in our society, particularly in an economic sense. Not only in an economic sense, but in particular in economics, capitalism. And it extends into the political realm and manifests itself in the ways that we compete, say, in the Texas legislature, when we really don't need to compete. And so again, this is one of those notions where there's so many dimensions to the you don't need to compete notion. In a minute, it can be discussed in the context of so many dimensions, of our social life, community life, political life, economic life, and so on. And that competition seems to overlook the interdependence that we actually have, which in the long run, I think could be beneficial to more of us if we didn't focus or weren't so bound to the competitive nature that we also experience.
Yeah, I think this was a big part of the book that has so much that we can dive into, because there are moments where there's the recognition of the individual for sure, and within nature, the individual act or the individual need, but it's always connected in understanding how it's a part of the bigger picture, right? So we do have a part to play. We may have a responsibility. We may have our own interactions that we're passionate about, but it's understanding in the context that it's not individualism overrides everything. And this is some of the nature we hear from Texans and people across America, especially like within the middle of the pandemic. It's about what I want, what I need. And when it comes to something like a pandemic, we need to understand how each of us are impacting each other, because we don't have control over this virus. We don't have some way to say, well, I don't want to participate because that's just not how the virus is going to work. It's going to spread as much as we allow it to spread. And so cooperation, interdependence and everything like that is really, really important. And a lot of people who push back against, let's say, government intervention, don't want that decision coming from the top down. And I think collectively, we probably feel like, well, we usually would not want a decision coming from top down, but when we collectively are not able to do it, then we need something like that to be able to push us into the direction we need to keep us safe. And so I think also just the things about capitalism system, the capitalist system is big, but for us in our work, we collaborate. And Jasmine, you mentioned the coalition we participate in over a dozen coalitions with organizations led by different groups and everything. But we see that competition happening even within advocacy work, within the nonprofit space, because of this mindset of scarcity and that there are only so many resources that we get to compete over. And that really is harming our ability to do the work that we need to do as different individual groups, but also connected to the larger movement of work that we're wanting. And I love how she calls this out within the book and how the nonprofit industry is contributing to that as well. And I think in another part of the book with another piece, she talks about how we emphasize the art of war versus the art of love. And I thought that was another great point that she made in terms of how are we actually nurturing, building those critical connections, understanding everyone's perspectives and contributions, and how are we collaborating with each other versus competing with each other, I think is a huge part that spoke to me directly and something I hope to see more and more in our organizing and organizing across the state in various ways. All right. Next up, we've got Mimicking Nature with Kurt. Kurt, go ahead and kick us off with that.
So Jasmine touched on this a little earlier. I think in part because this notion of mimicking nature occurs in multiple places in the book. But one thing in her introduction, she makes a statement that emergent strategies are ways for humans to practice complexity and grow the future through relatively simple interactions. What that brought to my mind, thinking, say, just about an organization like Indivisible TX Lege, or even our organization collaborating and participating with other organizations, is what occurs in nature. And she uses analogies across nature, but it brought to my mind the whole idea of a murmuration. A murmuration in nature, say, occurs when perhaps starlings or purple martins flock by the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of birds And it's very interesting because you can look at the whole as it's moving, it's constantly adapting. If you've ever seen one, you'll get what I'm talking about here. It's constantly adapting. But down at the individual bird level, you've got the interaction occurring with the bird next to the next bird and the next bird and the next bird. You get down to those simple interactions occurring between individual birds that are not competing, but they're striving for the same thing. And so the same thing in this sense for a murmuration might be protection from predators that like to pick off individual birds, but they find strength in the murmuration, because when you have 10,000 or millions of birds, it's a little bit harder for a hawk, let's say, to pick off an individual bird. So she uses this kind of analogy about how the collaborations at the minute level, at the individual person level, or let's say even with Indivisible TX Lege and its collaboration with other organizations, can also form its own murmuration and achieve purpose. It could be protection. Of course, the murmuration is also drives birds into to different feeding areas where they can prosper in that sense. So I liked her use of nature and the analogies there. The other thing about the murmuration idea, she thought of in this way, is also relevant to what she talks about, principles of emergent strategy. And one of this emphasizes the small. Small is good, small is all. The large is a reflection of the small. So this gets back to the notion we were talking about earlier about these individual collaborations, non-competitive collaborations. Change is constant also. Just like in a murmuration, it takes so many different shapes and forms. Unpredictably, it does, but it still does with a purpose. There's always enough time for the right work. I think that's a critical idea. There is conversation in the room that only these people at this moment can have. So again, you're down to, individual conversations. You're not talking about the murmuration level. You're talking individual conversations. And so she says, find that conversation and become part of it. And then she says, never a failure, always a lesson. So whatever you're doing, it's never a failure. Think of it in terms of it's always a lesson. And that those lessons can occur at that small level. And even though there are some failures, but if you always think of them in terms of lessons, then the organization can grow and mature. So I think it's, the idea of a murmuration also sort of deviates from this earlier notion we talked about, critical mass, where, simply the numbers is not the point of it. It's even though in a murmuration, there are large numbers of birds involved, it's not the critical mass that's important. It's what's going on between the individual birds, between the individuals in an organization. And so the emphasis to really achieve the purpose centers around those individual interactions, those small interactions that Jasmine talked about a little earlier. So I'm just sort of throwing that out there as a analysis. An example of how her focus on nature could be incorporated or thought about to help us think about what we're doing, and wanted to see if others had any similar sort of thoughts around the idea of the analogy of a murmuration to individual relationships, collaborations.
Yeah, thank you. Two things. One, on the birds, a big part of that that's mentioned somewhere else in the book is that they rotate who's at the front. And I think that's a big part of what we want to do in our work is a few folks, especially some folks here, take on an incredible amount of work. And it's, it's never ending here in Texas. So I think looking ahead and seeing how we can shift things, rotate who takes the lead on different things, so that we can keep the collective strong is something I'd love to see more. And I think bringing things to the local level, which is definitely what TX Lege group does. And she describes this well on page 52. It was and is devastatingly clear to me that until we have some sense of how to live our solutions locally, we won't be successful at implementing a just governance system regionally, nationally, or globally. So how do we look at that individual level, the local level, as a part of this whole, as a part of this collective?
Yeah, I had forgotten about the the point about if you look at a murmuration, you really can't tell who's in charge. I mean, it's a moving mass, but it's moving with purpose based on those individual relationships. Yeah, you can't tell exactly who's in charge. So anyone else have any thought about the use of an analogy in nature? Yeah.
I just loved how she described it, described murmuration, that there is a right relationship, a right distance between them. Too close and they crash, too far away and they can't feel the micro adaptations in their bodies. But that when we get too far away from one another, when we get too far away from those who don't have the same level of privilege that we do, not everyone can take off work, drive 8 hours to the Capitol, spend money on, like hotels or lodging and food while you're in Austin. Like how it's crazy. It's crazy to think that everyone has that access and that level of just ability to be a part of the process. Democracy is not a spectator sport. We love sports in Texas. It's not a spectator sport. We have to be involved. And in a state as large as Texas, in order for our democracy to function, to be, what she talks about, we have to create space for opportunities for Texans to be involved in creating the world that each of us hopes to live in, where we have access to healthcare that doesn't cripple the bank, that allows us to live our lives without retaliation and retribution for basic human rights.
Sharon, I want to check in with you, see if you have any thoughts.
I was very pleased for Lauren for everything everyone said, but Lauren just mentioning the quote on page 52 that it's very grassroots, isn't it? Until you learn how you do it locally, it's hard to make it build bigger. And I appreciate very much what Jasmine just said about using our voices. I think that when we have electeds who cannot hear us, we must speak, because they first have to hear us, and then we have to keep telling them, here is our vision, here is what we want. We recognize that person A's health condition, health, is dependent on person B. We should have learned that immediately in March and April of 2020. We are wise creatures, but we have a little maturing to do. And we would do well, I think, to turn to the sage advice of poets and artists and look at the long, successful function of animal. And it is our world to take care of, and then it can take care of us. Those are my peelings from this evening.
Well, I love the conversation about nature that she has, and everything we've talked about here. One of the things that stuck out for me is how humans throughout history have identified themselves with the alpha predator. So we're king of the jungle, or we're, whatever this, super apex predator is how we identify, versus identifying with all of these other different parts of nature. We've talked about birds. She also talks about cells, how cells do their individual job and do their thing. And this is what helps all of us become into an existence, right? So even at the microbiological level, to the other parts of nature, we almost are disrespectful to that perspective by overemphasizing this apex predator of a tiger or a lion or whatever. And she makes note that these are the animals, these apex predators are the ones that are becoming extinct. So what is that telling us about adaptability, the importance of being able to adapt and understand what is being done within our world, and how we are interacting with each other? It is 2021. Whatever history we learn about in the 20th century or before, or from thousands of years ago, it's definitely important to inform us, but we also have to understand what that means to the world we're in today. And we're dealing with problems that no one else has had to deal with. We have something like technology that we're on right now, being able to live stream on Facebook and YouTube and social media, and access to information that no other human generation has ever had access to. What does that mean in terms of how we adapt? Well, one of the ways we haven't been able to adapt is through the amount of misinformation that's out there, and how easy it is to get that misinformation and to spread that misinformation and things like that. And so this ability for us to adapt, and recognizing in nature how nature has adapted and continues to adapt over its much longer history than our own human history, I think is something for us to really take stock in. And I think that's something in our work that we continue to try to encourage organizers, and everything that we do. We have to continue to adapt in what we're doing. We can't just say, well, this is how we win, this is how we get what we want, and this is all we do. We have to be responsive to the environment we're in and make those adjustments. And I think that process of continue to have that feedback is a big important part of the work, which is going to lead me to our last section, which is around this work is nonlinear and it is iterative. So transformation does not happen in a linear way. Instead it happens in cycles, convergences, and explosions. And so what are the ways that we are interacting with this work and interacting with our world, so that we can be responsive to what's happening? I think there's a couple of quotes that she has that I'm going to try to dig into here real quick, but it makes me think of how we organize. And Sharon, you use the term "we are crunchy," or we use terms about trying to tilt the needle, or you hear a lot of terms like moving the Overton window. We're having conversations that were not popular to be had at different points. And that's a part of our work. That's a part of what we're doing. But in terms of nonlinear and iterative, I feel like what we try to emphasize with our organizers and with people we work with is put your energy and passion in what you want to do, and let that be your focus. A lot of times we're trying to decide for others, or we're trying to do more than we should. And she has a couple of points here that I just want to read quickly. Ask if this movement, formation, message is meant for you. If this serves you. If yes, get involved. She has an exclamation point. Get into an experiment or two. Feel how messy it is to unlearn supremacy and repurpose your life for liberation. And she goes on to say a couple other points there. And then she says, if no, divest your energy and attention. Pointing out the flaws of something still requires pointing at it, drawing attention to it, and ultimately growing it. Over the years, she had found that when a group isn't serving the people, it doesn't actually last that long. And then lastly, she says, and finally, if you don't want to invest growth energy in anything, just be quiet. If you're not going to help birth or raise the child, then shh. And I think it's important in our organizing work is to find where you're passionate about and pour yourself into that work. And if somebody else is doing work that you are not understanding or you're not passionate about, or there's different thoughts about it that you have, share your different thoughts about it. But if you don't want to participate in it being developed, then move on. Go and focus on the work that you are excited about. And that way, all of the work that is being done is able to grow us in different ways. And we don't need to have the herd mentality of all of us moving at once. We need to be able to have the mentality of us adapting and moving as we see fit for ourselves. So any final thoughts before we end this conversation? Lauren, looks like you got to hop off. Thanks so much for being with us. We'll be done here in just a minute.
Thank you. Yeah, take care, y'all. I appreciated it.
Well, I just want to reiterate that this is such a multi-dimensional book. It's very very divergent from what I typically read, and so like I say, it's for me, it's going to be a work in progress to read and try to apply concepts that maybe don't come naturally to me. But it's full of opportunities at the same time, and so I look forward to digesting it in smaller pieces and see where it leads. So thank you for the discussion, Alex. Yeah,
absolutely. Jasmine, you'll have our final thought. Sharon, if you got to go, thanks for being here. Jasmine, go for it.
Hi, Sharon. She gives us lessons on grief in the nonlinear. She talks about how emotional growth is nonlinear, that our failures have to be growth opportunities, and in life and in organizing in Texas, we've been faced with so much loss, and being able to feel our emotions and handle that grief and still have hope and still keep progressing and moving forward. I mean, it really takes being in the collective. It takes being together in a group that can see a greater future. She said, that said, the line between constructive critique and hater is a hard one to navigate. And over again, it's a hard book. It's, some of it is so simple. She breaks it down so simply, but, the concepts are so different from what we've been taught in America as a general rule. Rather than tearing someone down and hating on them, just building your own thing, just building on values and community. And so, I know that that's what we try to do in our organization. And I'm really excited to go through like some of those questions and sit there and think on them, because this is going to take a lot more time to chew on.
Well, we highly recommend this book, Emergent Strategy. Check it out. Check it out at your local library. Try to buy a copy for yourself if you're able to. Definitely dive into this book. If you end up reading it, reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you about it. Put any comments you have. If you've been able to read it in the chat, whether YouTube or Facebook, we'd love to respond to you. But thanks everyone for joining us for this conversation. We'll be with you in a couple of weeks with our next Reader Corner. So we're really excited to continue reading the list of books we have on our agenda for this rest of this year, and continue to share those books with all of you. So thanks everyone for your time. I hope y'all have a great start to the week.